Don Pinnock, South Africa. South African writer, investigative journalist and photographer, author of 17 books about history, politics, the environment, gangs and science. Don Pinnock is a research fellow at the Centre of Criminology, University of Cape Town. And the first question is criminalization of society. Criminalization always occurs, self-sufficient organization of people with their own rules, when states manifest failure to cope with extreme situation in the face of global threats. In turn, entities establish on their own without taking into account state interests, and other people tend to become criminalized and or regarded as such. So the discussion can be continued by Don Pinnock.
And I must say it's a great honor to be in the company of such distinguished specialists. So thank you for inviting me. I was challenged by the title of this discussion. It got me to think. My background as a criminologist has been working on gangs, which is very much an urban phenomenon. But for the last probably 5 or 6 years, I've been working on environmental crime, and it was the relationship between those two that got me thinking about how I will approach this issue. And one is it's crime depends on how you define it rather than the action itself. So it's criminal in terms of the definition, and I say that because we've had about 10 years in the South African system of a criminogenic government. And even the present president, who's trying to fight his way out of that, will admit that in fact, the government, the previous president and people around him have hollowed out the state and state systems in such a way that the airline is about to be grounded. The electricity supply doesn't have enough coal, and we have intermittent electricity. Provincial and local systems are not functioning because much of the money for them has been stolen. Now, I say all of this because if we look at how we come out of this pandemic, we have to understand how we went into it. South African currency, just as the pandemic started, was downgraded to junk status. So our financial system is in trouble. So anything that comes out of this pandemic has to take into account what the country was like when it went into it. Now, for the purpose of this talk, I want to look at really 3 areas of organized crime. One is, as I've been outlining, that the state itself has been criminogenic. It has bled the country. There are parts of the state that have bled the country dry, and particularly what happened is that the prosecutorial system was hollowed out. And so the ability to undertake action against criminal situations was massively reduced. The police themselves there's a lot of bribery and corruption. So the one side of the issue is the state itself. The second part of that is that I'm particularly involved in, and have been involved for many years in looking at the situation of gangs in Cape Town, but particularly. Now they will, in the way any mafia type organization, they will take advantage of any situation. They are networks of opportunity, as was pointed out earlier, and so they are looking for opportunities, and the degree to which the state is weakened in areas, these organizations, these syndicates will take over. Even now, there are parts of this city, Cape Town, that I live in, where the police will not get out of their vans at night. They are controlled by people with high levels of armaments, and the police will not go in without flak jackets and heavily armed. So how is it, what's it going to look like after this pandemic? People are confined to their homes. There's a lot of poverty going on. There's a lot of starvation because most of the people in this country are small. They operate off very small platforms, very small businesses, micro economics. The third area, and it's part of my present interest, is, and it's really across the whole of Africa, but South Africa is very central to that, and that is that the poaching systems across the continent have been decimating wildlife, and most of that goes to Asia, particularly China, Vietnam. And so I've been looking at what that means during the pandemic, during the lockdown. Formal illicit poaching has been locked down, really. And people can't transport ivory, rhino horns, pangolins across distances because they stick out, because everybody is locked down. But what has happened, and it's very deeply concerning, right across Africa, is that communities have lost jobs. They are locked down. They cannot get an income together. And so what they are doing is what's known as bushmeat poaching. They're killing animals. They're penetrating wildlife areas and parks, and they are hunting as their ancestors have done for thousands of years, actually, and they have to survive. So the parks without tourists, and the big problem is tourists provide the revenue that supports the parks. Without that structure in place, it's going to be very difficult to keep wildlife parks and the environment alive. So those are the three areas: the state issue, gangs in the urban areas, and largely in the rural areas, the problem with massive poaching. And let me stop there.
The second question for the discussion, as you remember, is criminalization ways, how it may take place. What are the new ways of the emergence of organized crime? Is it true that crime is taking over today? And what forms of crime might still appear after post-epidemic period?
I agree. We need to look backwards to look forwards. And it's very useful in South Africa to do that, because when we moved from an authoritarian regime to a democratic state, things didn't get better in the criminal sense, because transitional situations are always very useful for criminal markets to move in, and they did. We had syndicates moving in from all over the world to South Africa, and they did immense damage at all sorts of levels. At the upper levels, a family called the Guptas, an Indian family, moved in and totally subverted the upper sections of the state and taught senior government officials how to cheat. And they cheated massively. They virtually destroyed this country economically. The other thing that happened is that the drug routes, the heroin drug routes, were, I think, probably getting increasingly blocked going northwards, and they started coming south. So Cape Town particularly became a center of drugs moving east and west, and created all sorts of, massive drug problem in South Africa. Now, looking at those situations and hearing what people are saying, and I'm agreeing with them, we have a situation now where we have one of the hardest lockdowns in the world, I think. Complete lockdown. We've just been allowed out for 3 hours a day to do some exercise. But who is on the street are police and army, and they are not very well trained. They've already killed somebody for disobeying them, for standing in his yard drinking a beer when you're not supposed to have alcohol. And what the problem is that there's two routes out of this, which are being discussed here at the moment. And one is that we could, the COVID pandemic could be the catalyst for reordering of society, for uh, unblocking log jams, moving towards a greener economy. And there are definite moves to use it for that. But the other alternative is that, and unfortunately it's the more likely alternative, is that the transitional situation being caused by the pandemic is going to increase the possibility for criminal activity, as we've been hearing here today. And that will lead to increasing police pressure and a more authoritarian state. And we're seeing that starting to develop already. Bizarre situations. In the exercise period, somebody was arrested for standing still because he wasn't exercising. You know, it's a small issue, but it's a synecdoche for a much bigger issue here. Where the police and army and actually the Minister of Police is saying publicly things like, you know, the level of policing now is what we want in the future South Africa. It's very efficient. So there are real concerns now of a deepening of crime and a deepening of authoritarianism, and a conflict starting to develop between two sides, with the public in the middle being the losers.